It seems world politics grow more extreme by the day. Fringe groups are gaining momentum everywhere, and many governments are undergoing massive upheaval. But even as citizens of North America and Western Europe bemoan the state of their political sphere, other countries make them look idyllic by comparison. From Central Asian parliaments to North African generals, deceit and misconduct are prevalent all over the world. Today we're counting down the top 10 most corrupt governments. Central Asia, also nicknamed the Stans, are a hotbed for corruption and regressive government policies, and Uzbekistan is no exception. The impoverished former Soviet country has integrated graft and bribery into everyday life. Even though Uzbekistan is the second largest economy in Central Asia, thanks to its natural gas reserves, the GDP per capita is a measly $1,500. So the question remains, where does all that money go? Like many authoritarian countries, the money is extorted from the poor and given to a handful of wealthy oligarchs who resort to draconian methods to get what they want. Torture has become an essential tool for the authorities to retain their grip on power, with police and security forces frequently using it to extract confessions, to intimidate entire families, or to extract bribes. The most common forms include beatings, asphyxiation, rape, and sexual assault. In many cases, family members have been arbitrarily detained, tortured, and otherwise ill-treated to force them to confess to fabricated charges. On the basis of these confessions, they have been sentenced to long terms in prison after unfair trials. Though this corruption is well documented, only 11 police officers have been convicted for torture in the last 20 years, and in many cases they were used as scapegoats to protect the responsible officers. Turkmenistan is another Central Asian nation with a similar makeup to Uzbekistan. Like Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan has enormous natural gas reserves, meaning that the country is relatively wealthy. But this wealth is held by a handful of elite individuals who use whatever means necessary to cling to their capital. Bribery is necessary to accomplish even the simplest tasks. Bribes are often exchanged and are required to obtain public services in Turkmenistan. For instance, an unofficial payment of between $6,000 to $10,000 is needed to register a business. Public employees engage in corrupt practices, patronage is widespread, and government bureaucracy is confusing and cumbersome. And unlike other Central Asian nations, it's almost impossible to get a visa to visit Turkmenistan. This means that little is known about the inner workings of the country because they limit foreign influence and heavily control their media. But even with the scarce information available, Human Rights Watch ranks them as the second most repressive government in the world after North Korea. The president, his relatives, and their associates control all aspects of public life, and the authorities encroach on private life. The government carries out forced evictions without adequately compensating those affected. The government continues to conceal the fate and whereabouts of dozens of people forcibly disappearing following their imprisonment during waves of arrests in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Though the nation is relatively wealthy, the quality of life for most citizens is very poor. South Sudan is the world's youngest nation. After 2 bloody civil wars, the country gained independence from the Republic of Sudan in 2011. Conditions are dire in the country of 12 million, which has a nominal GDP per capita of just under $250. More than 4 million people have been forced to flee their homes, 200,000 of whom are sheltering in the United Nations compounds and hundreds of thousands as refugees in neighboring countries. The government has become increasingly intolerant and repressive, arbitrarily detaining critics, members of civil society, journalists, and politicians, often holding them for extended periods, sometimes years. Corruption permeates every part of public life in South Sudan, as the ruling class exploits millions of starving citizens. Like the other countries on this list, the country's oil reserves are mismanaged, and most profits end up in the hands of a few elite politicians. In addition, the military controls South Sudan's budget. There's little to no transparency in this process, and plenty of money is unaccounted for after the dust clears. The UN has already approved sanctions on the fledgling nation, but it will take serious reform before South Sudan has a normal quality of life. This landlocked nation links Central Asia with South Asia. The country has undergone dozens of invasions over the centuries from the British, the Soviet Union, and most recently a coalition of NATO troops led by the United States. Because of the constant onslaught from outside forces, Afghanistan has never established a consistent, legitimate government. It's still one of the poorest countries on Earth, with a GDP per capita of only $601. In addition, fighting between the Taliban and government forces in Afghanistan continues to have a devastating impact on civilians, particularly children. Thousands of civilians were killed and injured in 2017 in insurgent suicide and improvised explosive device attacks, while indiscriminate aerial and mortar attacks by government forces added to the civilian toll. Both the Taliban and government forces have increasingly used schools for military purposes, and though the country created an anti-corruption tribunal, it seems to be largely ineffective. Many believe this is because various warring groups hold just as much power power as the government. Less than half of victims who report incidents of violence or crime in Afghanistan do so to the police, and citizens rate the judiciary as the most corrupt institution in the country. The government urgently needs to restore the public's trust in the state's ability to deliver justice. Until then, Afghanistan is likely to hover near the top of the corruption list. Much like its new southern neighbor, Sudan has been war-torn for decades and is almost completely reliant on foreign aid, much of which never reaches those who need it most. And just like South Sudan, corruption is rampant. The government owns partial stakes in most of the country's privately owned companies, leading to kickbacks and slush funds on both sides. Beyond this, financial records are very loosely maintained, and most of the country's resources are exploited by President Omar al-Bashir and his allies. Since mid-December, protesters have taken to the streets in towns and cities across Sudan to protest price increases and call on al-Bashir, who has been in power for 29 years, to step down. In response, government forces have shot scores of protesters dead and arbitrarily detained hundreds of opposition party members, protesters, students, journalists, and professionals, including doctors and medics. Authorities have also restricted media coverage of the protests. Because its bloody civil wars thrust Sudan into the spotlight, many people are acutely aware of their dire situation. But that doesn't make it easier to help a country who refuses to help its own populace in order to line the pockets of corrupt politicians. Yemen has been in the news recently, as it was revealed that Saudi Arabia is instigating a war in the country that has led to widespread starvation and even genocide. The conflict between the Saudi-led coalition and Houthi forces has exacerbated the dire humanitarian situation and taken a terrible toll on Yemeni civilians. The coalition's scores of indiscriminate airstrikes have killed and wounded thousands of civilians in violation of the laws of war. Houthi forces have fired artillery indiscriminately into Yemeni cities and launched rockets into populated areas of Saudi Arabia. And the worst part is, the international aid that floods into the country is almost always diverted away from the poor by corrupt officials and military. Across Yemen, factions and militias on all sides of the conflict have blocked food aid from going to groups suspected of disloyalty, diverting it to the frontline combat units or selling it for profit on the black market. Corruption is also common among the police department and judicial system. Essentially, you can buy the outcome of any court case, regardless of your guilt. Add to this nepotism, bank fraud, and election fraud, and you have one of the most corrupt governments imaginable. Hopefully, the renewed spotlight on Yemen will help to shrink its nefarious past. Egypt is an ancient nation with a long-standing history of graft and inequality. The president's government continues to preside over the worst human rights crisis in the country in decades. Police systematically use torture, arbitrary arrests, and enforced disappearances to silence political dissent. Thousands of civilians were tried by military courts. By introducing new restrictive NGO legislation, detaining journalists, and prosecuting human rights defenders and subjecting them to travel bans, the government is working to eradicate independent civil society in the country. The crackdown on LGBT people has grown increasingly vicious, along with the continued repression of labor activists. The president came to power in 2011 after a series of leadership changes following the Arab Spring. Since then, things have only gotten worse. Extortion is a fact of life for Egyptian business owners, and there's little to no legal framework to prosecute these crimes when they occur. Bakshish, literally meaning bribery, is part of Egyptians' everyday life. Many fear that bribery is so ingrained into daily life in Egypt that it will be almost impossible to eradicate. Corruption has never been a stranger to the Syrian nation, as it exists in every state sector, institution, ministry, and especially in its judicial sector. And this was before ISIS made Syria its primary stronghold. Since then, the rule of law has been completely abandoned, and citizens are left to fend for themselves or find shelter in a host nation. The conflict in Syria continues to be characterized by human rights and international humanitarian law violations, with over 400,000 dying since 2011. Anti-government armed groups have attacked civilians, kidnapped, and tortured. Civilian casualties from US and US-led coalition airstrikes against ISIS surged, while ISIS planted landmines and used human shields. According to the World Bank, restructuring the economy to a functional state would cost $250 billion, and that number keeps rising with each day the war continues. For a country which only has a $108 billion GDP, coming up with that money will be all but impossible. Until then, they are completely reliant on foreign aid and altruism. Made famous for widespread piracy and violence, Somalia has a reputation for all the wrong things. In December 2018, the United States announced that it would cut military aid to Somalia due to massive corruption. As of now, there is no functional judicial system. Business is based on patronage networks, and tight monopolies dominate the market. In late 2016 and early 2017, Somalia elected its parliamentary representatives and senators in one of the country's most competitive polls in modern-day history. Reports suggest that up to $20 million feverishly changed hands during parliamentary elections. Analysts rank the elections as the most fraudulent political events in Somalia's history. However, the country's president says fighting corruption remains his government's main priority for now, vowing to strengthen the country's justice sector in a bid to improve the image of Somalia and remove it from the bottom of the Global Corruption Index. With limited options, Somali citizens are forced to turn to crime just to feed themselves. Even with these illegitimate revenue streams, the GDP per capita is still an anemic $671. This should come as no surprise. North Korea is a legendarily unstable country. Though they're more secretive than any other country on Earth, limited documentation has proven that North Korea governs its people with a twisted theocracy, placing Kim Jong-un in the role of dear leader and deity. While he extols the success of his governmental programs, even higher-class citizens are forced to eat grass just to survive. Aside from widespread executions and torture, North Korea counts on bribery and drug trade to fund most of its budget. Recently, authorities began charging $150 for supervised phone calls to family members in South Korea. This is an outrageous price as the GDP per capita in North Korea is around $1,800. It's alleged that North Korea's illegal drug trade dates back to the 1970s and includes the manufacturing, selling, and trafficking of illicit drugs, as well as counterfeit, otherwise legal pharmaceuticals. To provide a cover of legitimacy, the North Korean government used front companies, like the Ryungyong Corporation under the control of the Korean Workers' Party's Foreign Relations Department, to conduct clandestine activities. The company also holds large tracts of land within the country for the sole purpose of growing opium, and each year the company sends tens of thousands of dollars in hard currency to Kim Jong-il for his use. Unlike most companies, Ryungyong Corporation has no import or export quota restrictions. And since the 1990s, North Korea has been manufacturing methamphetamine on an enormous scale, mostly to sell in China. Clearly, the level of corruption is rampant when the entire government has resorted to cooking meth in order to balance their checkbook. For this reason and many more, North Korea has the most corrupt government in the world.